Welcome everyone to the new expanded edition of the Mass Readings Explained, where we're going to be adding an additional video each week that is focused just on the second reading from the Sunday readings. So if you've been journeying with us over the course of our 3-year study of the Gospels, Year A, the Gospel of Matthew, Year B, Mark, and Year C, the Gospel of Luke, you might have noticed that I ordinarily skip over the second reading from the New Testament letters, the epistles. Usually they're writing from Paul. And you might have wondered why I do that. Well, the answer is simple, but it's really important. Namely this, that during Sundays in ordinary time, the second reading in the lectionary from the New Testament letters is on its own independent 3-year cycle. It's on its own cycle of Year A, Year B, and Year C. Now, I don't know about you, but as I was growing up, I remember becoming pretty familiar with the fact that there was a year assigned to each of the 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and that we were on this 3-year cycle. But it wasn't until I actually started studying the lectionary for myself that I was even aware that there was a second 3-year cycle of A, B, and C for the second reading, namely from the letters of St. Paul. So what I've discovered was, if you study the way the lectionary was framed, the framers of the lectionary actually intended for that second reading to be on its own independent track, so that you could actually have a preacher, a pastor, or a priest, deacon, preach through one of the letters of Paul, whether it be Romans or Corinthians or Galatians, whatever it might be. So for example, in this chart here that I have in my daily Roman Missal, there's a 3-year cycle of all of the readings of St. Paul. Year A, Year B, and Year C for Sundays in ordinary time. So if you look at it carefully, you'll see that, for example, in Year A, the church spends over 10 weeks working through the letter to the Romans in order. Or, for example, in Year B, the church spends about 6 or 7 weeks working through Paul's letter to the Ephesians in Year B. And then, for example, in Year C, the church spends another 6 weeks or so working through Paul's letter to the Galatians in order. So the idea when the lectionary was framed was that if preachers wanted to preach through the gospel, they could do that. But if they wanted to preach through the letters of Paul in order, they could just focus on the second reading. You might be thinking here, well, wait, why would they do this? Why would they imagine such a scenario? Well, this was actually an attempt to retrieve an ancient Christian practice of preaching through the letters of St. Paul. So for example, in the 4th century AD, St. John Chrysostom, one of my favorite early church fathers, actually preached through all of the letters of Paul when he was bishop in the church in Constantinople. And we have all of those homilies. And what he would do is he would work through the letters of Paul in order. And today, what the church does is, in a sense, model the lectionary on that ancient practice of preaching what's called semi-continuously. In other words, you walk through a particular letter of Paul, just like we do with the Gospels, in the order in which the passages occur. So, I'm very excited because what we're going to be doing now in this new series of videos of the Mass Readings Explained in an expanded edition is adding a video where I focus on explaining the letters of Paul in particular for all of the Sundays in ordinary time, and working through them with you in order. Now, just a quick caveat. There are going to be times where this gets broken up. So during the seasons of Lent or the season of Advent or Christmas, we're not actually going to focus primarily on Paul. There are going to be quotations from other letters in the New Testament, like the letter of James or 1st and 2nd Peter or 1st and 2nd and 3rd John. And we're going to have a lot of fun looking at those other apostolic letters too. But I'm particularly excited about explaining Paul for 2 reasons. First, the vast majority of second readings for the Sundays throughout the year are from the letters of St. Paul, who, by the way, in Catholic tradition is known as the Apostle. You might think Peter is the Apostle for the Catholic tradition, but actually you look at the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas or the Catechism, whenever it says the Apostle, it means the Apostle Paul. So Paul has a special pride of place in the canon of the New Testament and in the lectionary as the preacher to the Gentiles, the apostle to the nations. So what the church is doing is giving us this semi-continual reading of the letters of Paul so that we can hear his exhortations, so that we can hear his preaching resounding in our ears, just as it resounded in the ears of the first Gentiles to whom the gospel was brought when Paul brought the good news to the Roman world in the 1st century AD. So if you've ever wanted to study Paul more in depth, or if you're like a lot of Catholics and you think, well, okay, I understand Jesus and I'm comfortable with Peter, but Paul, I don't know what to make of him, then I promise you, stay with me on this journey, walk with me through the letters of Paul, and you're going to learn a lot. Or at least I'm going to have a lot of fun talking about it. Whether you learn anything or not, we'll let you decide that. One final aspect of this part of the series in closing that I want to highlight is this. When the framers of the lectionary put together these quotations, these sections from Paul's letters, and they are sections, by the way. We're not going to work through the entire letter to the Romans or the entire letter to the Corinthians. There's just not enough time and not enough space. So the quotations will tend to be short. When the framers of the lectionary chose these passages from Paul, they frequently highlighted sections from Paul where he's dealing with the moral life in Christ or the spiritual life. In other words, he's dealing with vices and virtues. And this was a fact of history because Paul, remember, he's preaching to the Gentiles. So he has to teach them how to abandon their old way of living and embrace a new life in Christ. And what you'll often see in the gospel readings is Jesus is preaching to Jews. I've emphasized that over and over again. So a lot of times he will leave unexplained certain moral assumptions that all Jews shared or certain spiritual practices that all the Jews had in common. But Paul didn't have that luxury. Because he was preaching to ex-pagans, he often had to kind of spell out how they were to live now that they were baptized disciples of Christ, or as Paul liked to call them, now that they were saints, holy ones. So throughout this series of videos, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pay particular attention to Paul's teaching on morality and spirituality. And I hope that that will be a helpful complement to the other videos on the Gospels in the Old Testament, where I paid a lot of attention to typology, right? The relationship between the Old and New Testament. So that if we bring all of this together, you'll get a full sense of the great riches, the great treasure that the church has given to us in the lectionary. So look forward to spending this time with you in this new series of videos, the Mass Readings Explained Expanded Edition.